So what Charlie Brower is trying to get at here is the different approaches to environmentalism, and again, this issue of charismatic megafauna that we discussed earlier. Um, the notion of sustainable has been in the American consciousness for about a generation, while it has been the cornerstone of Inupiat life for millennia. Again, this comes from Smith's piece, and again, this is really, I think, emblematic of notions of sustainability and how this term came into existence and how it's utilized and how it's thought about and what it actually means in terms of long-term sustainability and viability, both in an ecological and cultural sense. Bronen, who is a lawyer and anthropologist in Alaska, looks at climate-induced community relocations, creating an adaptive governance framework based in human rights doctrine. And so Bronen essentially utilizes human rights documents, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And she utilizes these along with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and looks at this issue of what she calls climate migration or climigration. And she considers the impacts on indigenous communities through a human rights framework to look at these climate-induced relocations. So Shishmaref would potentially be one with increase in coastal erosion that are intensifying potentially with sea level rise, melting ice, as talked about in the film, Losing Ground. The other issue here is in Kivalina, which is what she writes specifically about, and you can see a picture of it above here, as well as the coastal lines and predictions for where the shore will be over time. She documents some of the impacts that climate changes have had to date in the Arctic, again with particular emphasis on Nutok, also Kivalina. Nutok is a traditional Yupik Eskimo village, which is located close to the Bering Sea in far western Alaska. She notes that the limitations of the current U.S. governmental responses to disasters under things like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, and the agency, FEMA agency, which limit the ability to respond to a disaster that has yet to occur, rather than a sort of a slow-moving disaster or disaster in progress. And so she attempts in her piece here to develop an alternative means of coping with disasters by applying human rights law to this, what she views from her legal background as a legal issue. Now, anthropologists have focused on this issue of climate and adaptability and resilience in a number of different contexts, not merely the Arctic. I'm going to talk about 3 articles very quickly here at the end to give you a sense of some of the differences that anthropologists have talked about in terms of climate change, global change, and adaptation in particular local spaces. Adaptation in anthropology goes back to Julian Stewart's work. Again, he was a cultural ecologist, and this idea goes back to 1955. Adaptation can be thought about as a local response process that becomes encoded in the cultural sphere. This insight leads to the current discussion, which focuses on technologies and the elusive search for large-scale cookie-cutter solutions, so the silver bullet magic technological solution that is essentially going to solve the problem everywhere for all cultures and all peoples. Nelson and co-authors examined 4 themes in adaptation to climate change literature. First, the process of adaptation is multiscalar in nature with a global origin and scope with adaptive responses within a local context. 2, inequality and exposure to climate change as well as the ability to respond. 3, climate change can only be understood in relation to other non-climatic drivers that either mitigate or aggravate the impacts of climate change. So, for example, cap and trade, an economic form of dealing with carbon trading, as well as production, industrial production processes, which are necessarily not carbon neutral to any extent. Imagine pumping massive amounts of carbon, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as a whole. And that successful adaptation requires the effective inclusion and participation of local communities. And this is something that anthropologists have stressed in a number of different contexts, the idea of localizing the locus of power. They call for anthropologists to become involved in the intergovernmental panel on climate change as a whole. Nelson and co-author Finan in Praying for Drought, Persistent Vulnerability in the Politics of Patronages in Ceará, Northeast Brazil, talk about the recurrent cycle of drought and emergency relief. This was initiated during the late 19th century and has essentially become an institutionalized form of adaptation to crisis, recognizable and articulated within the larger model of patronage. And so this cultural system of patronage to support individuals in various political positions, essentially a quid pro quo, an exchange in support of economic resources for political support. And here you see the institutionalization of emergency aid and relief in the context of drought. And so this becomes part of the adaptive cycle as a whole, is seeking out this relief. So what Nelson and Finan maintain is that this puts limits on choice as well as agency, and as a consequence assures persistent vulnerability of rural families. In terms of forecasting, families did not have the necessary options to tailor their responses to a range of forecasts. Although GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and community-based vulnerability maps were established in order to produce planning. There were massive amounts of resources that were spent in combating drought. Many were directed at the symptoms of vulnerability rather than towards resolving the underlying causes of vulnerability in the region. So they call for a shift to focus on building adaptive capacity, which is they refer to as decentered democracy, rather than praying for drought, which they view as restricting human agency and limiting adaptive capacity. The idea is they're just essentially become reliant upon this aid and assistance. And so this is what others in anthropology have called the development of underdevelopment. Finally, Vásquez-León looks at Hispanic farmers and farm workers, social networks, institutional exclusion, and climatic vulnerability in southeastern Arizona. This article examines how climatic vulnerability intersects with other factors, including class and ethnicity, to differently structure not only risk, but also opportunities to mitigate that risk. They note that in contrasting Anglo farmers with Hispanic farmers, that Anglo farmers predominantly rely on institutional support in times of drought for access to scarce water resources, as well as funding. These are not equally available to Hispanic farmers, who rather rely on social networks for achieving low-interest loans as well as necessary labor for farms. For farm workers as a whole, what Vásquez-León does is goes through the notion of farm workers as a group and notes that this is in fact not a uniform group in terms of access to social capital. Nevertheless, for the mestizo farm worker population, sharing information such as the occurrence of drought or frost in a given region can mitigate the impacts of climatic variability on livelihoods. In other words, if a crop has been wiped out, it wouldn't make much sense for massive numbers of migrant farm workers to move into an area to be doing this sort of work. Anglo farmers achieve success through a variety of historic and continued institutional support. They note that this is a result of their own skill in hard work, essentially, that has allowed them to achieve success, and in this way imply that being unsuccessful in farming is a result of somehow the personal failings of other farmers. And again, this is mapped onto notions of class, ethnicity, and race. So overall, these last couple pieces talk a little bit about adaptive capacity, resilience, adaptation, and the unequal structuring of risks in different populations. And so this really goes to the question of the impacts of climate change and how the impacts of climate change are differentially or disproportionately felt by differently situated populations. We talked about different ways that we know that the climate is changing, how this has become contested within the United States in particular, particularly as documented in the film Climate of Doubt by Frontline, and how polls have been shifting somewhat over the last few years, particularly in response to the essential attack on the science of climate change with introducing uncertainty and doubt. And we can see this with the Gallup polls. We talked about some basic factors such as weather and climate and how those are different from one another. I gave one example from recent literature that illustrates, in fact, the science behind colder weather patterns over the winter of 2013. We talked about greenhouse gas emissions overall, looked at public opinion, and I gave ethnographic examples from Alaska and elsewhere.